On an April morning in 2019, a mother in Crystal Lake, Illinois called 911 to report that her 5-year-old son had vanished from his bed during the night. And for 6 days, a community searched for a little boy who had already been buried in a shallow grave by the very people who were supposed to protect him. Before we dive into this haunting story, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. And if this case stays with you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow we uncover another story that will linger long after the screen fades to black. The search for A.J. Freund would mobilize hundreds of volunteers and law enforcement officers. It would generate national media coverage and an outpouring of concern from people who had never met the boy but who felt compelled to help find him. Flyers bearing his photograph were distributed throughout northern Illinois. Vigils were held. Prayers were offered. A community refused to give up hope. But from the very first moments of the investigation, something was wrong. The story the parents told did not add up. The details shifted and contradicted. The house where A.J. had lived told its own story, a story of neglect and abuse that child welfare agencies had seen but failed to stop. And as detectives pressed harder, as the evidence mounted, the terrible truth emerged. A.J. Freund had not been kidnapped by a stranger. He had been murdered by his own parents, beaten to death for a minor transgression, his small body hidden in a field while his killers pretended to search for him. This is the story of Andrew A.J. Freund, a little boy who deserved so much better than he got, and the system that failed him again and again until it was too late. Crystal Lake is a city of approximately 40,000 people in McHenry County, Illinois, about 50 miles northwest of Chicago. It takes its name from the lake at its center, a body of water that has drawn residents and visitors for more than a century. The city is suburban, in sociocultural character, a place of shopping centers and subdivisions, of good schools and safe streets, the kind of community where families move to raise children away from the problems of the big city. The area around Crystal Lake had grown significantly in the decades leading up to 2019, part of the suburban sprawl that extended ever outward from Chicago. New developments replaced farmland, bringing young families seeking affordable housing and good schools. The population was predominantly white and middle class, though pockets of poverty existed, as they do in most communities. The Freund family lived in one of those pockets. Their home on Dole Avenue was a modest single-family house in an older neighborhood, the kind of place that had seen better days. The house itself showed signs of neglect, peeling paint, overgrown yard, the general air of a property whose residents had neither the resources nor the motivation to maintain it properly. Inside, the conditions were far worse than the exterior suggested. The house was cluttered and dirty, with garbage accumulating in corners and dishes piling up in the sink. The smell of dog waste permeated the air. It was not a home so much as a shelter, a place where people existed rather than lived. Joanne Cunningham and Andrew Freund Sr. were the adults responsible for this household. They had met several years earlier and had 2 children together, A.J., born in 2013, and a younger son born in 2018. Their relationship was marked by instability, substance abuse, and involvement with the child welfare system that would become central to the tragedy that unfolded. Joanne Cunningham was 36 years old in 2019. She had a history of drug addiction, particularly to opioids, that had affected her life for years. She had been in and out of treatment programs, had struggled to maintain employment, had cycled through periods of sobriety and relapse. Her addiction had brought her into contact with the legal system multiple times and had raised concerns about her ability to care for her children. Andrew Freund Sr. was 60 years old, significantly older than Joanne. He worked sporadically, had his own history of substance abuse, and had largely failed to provide the stable home environment that children need. He was passive, where Joanne was volatile, enabling her behavior rather than challenging it, going along with whatever she decided rather than standing up for his children. Together, they created a household defined by chaos, neglect, and abuse. Their children lived in squalor, exposed to drug use, subjected to discipline that crossed the line into cruelty. It was exactly the kind of environment that child welfare systems are designed to identify and address. And indeed, the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services had been involved with the Freund family for years. A.J. Freund came into the world under circumstances that foreshadowed the tragedy to come. He was born on November 29, 2013, at a hospital in the Chicago area. Hospital staff noticed immediately that something was wrong. Joanne tested positive for opioids at the time of delivery, meaning that A.J. was born with drugs in his system. This should have been a critical intervention point. A baby born drug exposed is a baby at risk, and child welfare agencies are supposed to ensure that such children are protected. DCFS was notified of A.J.'s birth circumstances and opened an investigation. But the investigation was eventually closed, and A.J. was sent home with his parents. Over the next 5 years, DCFS would receive multiple reports about the Freund family. Neighbors, relatives, medical professionals, and others expressed concerns about the children's welfare. Reports described a home that was unsuitable for children, parents who were using drugs, children who appeared neglected or abused. Each report triggered some level of investigation, and each investigation ended without the children being removed from the home. The agency's file on the Freund family grew thick with documentation. Reports were investigated, findings were made, plans were developed, and cases were closed. The cycle repeated again and again. Someone would raise a concern. DCFS would look into it. DCFS would determine that the children could remain in the home, and life would continue as before. In 2015, when A.J. was about 2 years old, DCFS investigated a report of neglect. The house was found to be in poor condition, with hazards that posed risks to young children. Joanne was offered services, including parenting classes and substance abuse treatment. She participated minimally, did enough to satisfy the caseworkers, and the case was eventually closed as resolved. In 2017, another report came in, this time alleging that Joanne was using drugs while caring for the children. Investigators found evidence consistent with the allegation, but determined that the children were not in immediate danger. More services were offered, more promises were made, and the case was closed. The pattern continued into 2018. Reports came in about the children's hygiene, about their developmental delays, about marks and bruises that might indicate abuse. Each time, caseworkers visited the home, spoke with the parents, and made determinations that, in retrospect, seem inexplicable. How could anyone have looked at that home, at those children, at those parents, and concluded that everything was fine? The reasons for these failures were complex, reflecting systemic problems with child welfare agencies across the country. Caseworkers were overloaded, many carrying caseloads of 40, 50, or even more families, when best practices recommended no more than 12 to 15. There simply was not enough time to give each case the attention it deserved. Training was inadequate. leaving caseworkers poorly prepared to recognize the signs of abuse and manipulation. Parents like Joanne Cunningham learned to game the system, to say the right things, to clean up just enough before a scheduled visit, to present a facade that conceals the reality. Without proper training, caseworkers may take that facade at face value. Resources were limited, making it difficult to provide the intensive services that families like the Freunds required. Substance abuse treatment, mental health services, parenting education, and regular monitoring all cost money, and that money was not always available. Caseworkers were forced to make do with inadequate tools. The legal standards for removing children from their parents were also high, requiring clear evidence of imminent danger before the state could intervene in the parent-child relationship. This standard exists for good reason. It prevents the government from removing children arbitrarily and protects the fundamental right of parents to raise their children. But it also means that children sometimes remain in dangerous situations because the danger is not quite imminent enough to justify removal. Perhaps most significantly, there was an institutional bias toward keeping families together, a philosophy that had become deeply embedded in child welfare practice. The reasoning was not unreasonable. Children generally do better with their biological families. The foster care system has its own problems, and supporting struggling families is preferable to breaking them apart. But this philosophy, applied without sufficient attention to the needs of individual children, could leave kids like AJ trapped in homes where they were being harmed. In December 2018, just 4 months before AJ's death, DCFS investigated a report that should have changed everything. AJ had been brought to the hospital by his parents, who claimed he had fallen down the stairs. But the injuries on his small body told a different story. The hospital staff documented bruises covering much of AJ's body. Some were fresh, dark purple, and tender. Others were older, fading to yellow and green, evidence of injuries that had been inflicted over time. The pattern was inconsistent with a single fall and entirely consistent with sustained physical abuse. Medical professionals recognized immediately that something was terribly wrong. DCFS was notified, as the law required. An investigator was assigned to the case, a caseworker who was already handling dozens of other families, who had to prioritize among competing demands, who had to make decisions with incomplete information and insufficient time. The investigator interviewed the parents, who offered explanations for the bruises. AJ was clumsy, they said. He fell frequently. He bruised easily. The explanations were unconvincing, but they were explanations, and the burden of proof was on the state. AJ was placed in the protective custody of a relative for a brief period while the investigation continued. This should have been a turning point, an opportunity to get AJ out of that house and keep him out. For a few weeks he was safe, living with someone who was not beating him, experiencing what it might feel like to be a normal child. But the relative's home was deemed unsuitable for long-term placement. There were concerns about space, about resources, about the relative's ability to meet AJ's needs. And so, after the brief respite, AJ was returned to his parents. The decision to return AJ to his parents' care was made after what the caseworker believed was a thorough assessment. The parents had cooperated with the investigation. They had accepted services. They had made assurances that the abuse would not continue. The caseworker, working within a system that emphasized family preservation, made the decision that she believed was appropriate given the information available. She was wrong. The decision was catastrophically wrong. And 4 months later, A.J. Freund was dead. The caseworker who made that decision would later face scrutiny and discipline. But she was not the only one responsible. Her supervisors approved her decisions. The system's policies guided her choices. The resources available to her shaped her options. The failure was systemic, not just individual, even if individuals bore some measure of blame. This pattern of systemic failure would become a central theme in the aftermath of A.J.'s death. Illinois, like many states, had a child welfare system that was not functioning as it should, that was leaving children in dangerous situations, that was prioritizing family preservation over child safety in cases where that priority was deadly wrong. A.J.'s death would force a reckoning with these failures, though whether that reckoning would lead to meaningful change remained to be seen. Andrew A.J. Freund was 5 years old in the spring of 2019. Despite everything he had endured, despite the chaos and neglect and abuse that defined his short life, he was described by those who knew him as a sweet, happy child. He attended kindergarten at a local school where his teachers noticed both his potential and his struggles. He was developmentally behind in some areas, likely due to the instability of his home life, but he was eager to learn, eager to please, eager for the attention and affection that every child deserves. Photographs of A.J. show a boy with a shy smile and watchful eyes. He had brown hair and a gap-toothed grin, the look of a child who still believed the world might be kind to him. He liked dinosaurs and superheroes, the same things that millions of other 5-year-old boys like. He was, in every way that mattered, just a normal kid who happened to be born into circumstances that were anything but normal. The last months of A.J.'s life were marked by increasing violence. Joanne Cunningham's drug use had escalated, and with it, her volatility and cruelty. She had begun using A.J. as a target for her frustrations, punishing him harshly for minor infractions, subjecting him to abuse that left marks on his small body. Andrew Sr. either participated in the abuse or failed to prevent it, making him equally culpable in the eyes of the law. The specific incident that led to A.J.'s death occurred on or around April 15, 2019. According to later testimony and evidence, Joanne became enraged at A.J., likely over something trivial, something that a 5-year-old might do without understanding it was wrong. She beat him, not for the first time, but this time she went too far. The beating was severe enough to cause fatal injuries. A.J. did not die immediately. Evidence suggested that he lingered for some time after the beating, his small body fighting to survive the trauma it had endured. His parents did not seek medical attention for him. They did not call 911. They did not rush him to an emergency room where doctors might have saved his life. Instead, they let him suffer and die, prioritizing their own self-preservation over their child's survival. When A.J. finally died, his parents faced a choice. They could report his death, accept responsibility for what they had done, and face the consequences. Or they could try to cover it up, hide the body, and claim that he had disappeared. They chose the latter path, a choice that added another layer of cruelty to an already unconscionable crime. On the night of April 15th, or the early morning hours of April 16th, Andrew Freund Sr. wrapped A.J.'s body in plastic and placed it in the trunk of his car. He drove to a remote location in Woodstock, a town a few miles north of Crystal Lake, and buried his son's body in a shallow grave in a field. He returned home, and he and Joanne began constructing the lie that they would tell the world. On the morning of April 18, 2019, 3 days after AJ's death, Joanne Cunningham called 911 to report that her son was missing. Her voice on the recording sounded distressed, though detectives would later describe it as performed rather than genuine. She told the dispatcher that she had put AJ to bed the night before, and when she went to wake him in the morning, he was gone. "I went to go get him up this morning, and he wasn't there," Joanne said on the 911 call. "I've looked everywhere. I've looked in closets. I've looked in the backyard. I've looked everywhere." The Crystal Lake Police Department responded immediately. Officers arrived at the Dole Avenue home to find a scene that immediately raised suspicions. The house was in deplorable condition, filthy and cluttered, not the kind of environment where a child should be living. Joanne and Andrew Sr. were present, along with their younger son, who was immediately taken into protective custody by DCFS. Detectives began interviewing the parents, taking their statements, probing for details about when AJ was last seen and what might have happened to him. The story Joanne and Andrew told was that AJ had been put to bed at his normal time, that they had not heard anything during the night, and that he had simply vanished by morning. The story did not hold up to even basic scrutiny. How could a 5-year-old leave his home in the middle of the night without making any noise, without leaving any evidence of his departure? If he had wandered off, why hadn't he been found nearby? If he had been taken, how had someone entered the home without waking the parents? Detectives noted the parents' demeanor as well. They seemed more concerned with managing their own situation than with finding their son. Their grief seemed performative rather than genuine. Small details in their behavior suggested that they knew more than they were telling. Despite these suspicions, the police could not immediately prove what had happened. A child was missing, and regardless of what the parents might be hiding, the first priority was to find him. The search for AJ Freund began in earnest. The search for AJ Freund mobilized resources throughout McHenry County and beyond. Police officers from Crystal Lake, McHenry, and surrounding jurisdictions joined the effort. The FBI's became involved almost immediately, bringing federal resources and expertise to what was clearly a high-priority case. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children provided support, helping to distribute AJ's photograph and coordinate the search effort. Search and rescue teams with dogs trained to track human scent were deployed throughout the Crystal Lake area. The dogs worked methodically through neighborhoods, parks, and open spaces, their handlers watching for any reaction that might indicate AJ had been there. Ground searchers walked in careful lines through fields and forests, checking every location where a child might be found. Dive teams searched nearby bodies of water. Crystal Lake, the body of water that gave the city its name, was checked, along with ponds and streams in the area. The water searches were a grim acknowledgement of the possibilities that no one wanted to contemplate. The recognition that if AJ had been harmed, his body might have been disposed of in this way. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew over the area, particularly at night, when the contrast between a warm body and the cool ground would be most apparent. The distinctive sound of the helicopters became a constant presence in Crystal Lake's skies, a reminder to everyone below that a child was missing and that every resource was being deployed to find him. Hundreds of volunteers joined the official search efforts. They gathered at staging areas, set up in parking lots and community centers, received briefings on where to search and what to look for, and fanned out across the area in organized groups. Many were parents themselves, driven by the primal fear that what had happened to AJ could happen to their own children, determined to do something to help. The volunteers searched parks and playgrounds, construction sites and abandoned buildings, wooded areas and open fields. They knocked on doors, asking residents if they had seen AJ, if they had noticed anything unusual, if they had any information at all. They distributed flyers to businesses, posted them on telephone poles, spread AJ's image as widely as possible. The media coverage was extensive, amplifying the search effort and keeping AJ's face in front of the public. Local television stations led their broadcasts with updates on the search. Chicago's major network affiliates covered the story, recognizing that a missing child in the suburbs was news that viewers throughout the region would follow. National outlets picked up the story as well, spreading AJ's photograph to an audience of millions. Social media played an increasingly important role in the search. AJ's photograph was shared millions of times on Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms. Groups dedicated to finding him sprung up, organizing volunteer efforts and sharing information. The viral spread of his image meant that within hours, people across the country and around the world knew his face and his story. Vigils were held for AJ at various locations in Crystal Lake and surrounding communities. Residents gathered to light candles, to pray, to stand together in solidarity with a family they believed was suffering the nightmare of every parent. The gatherings were somber but hopeful, reflecting the community's determination to believe that AJ would be found safe. At these vigils, Joanne Cunningham and Andrew Freund Sr. appeared as grieving parents, accepting the sympathy and support of neighbors and strangers. They cried and embraced, held candles, and bowed their heads, played their roles with a commitment that in retrospect seems almost sociopathic. They knew their son was dead. They knew where his body was buried. And yet they stood among those searching for him and pretended to hope. The deception was maintained for days. Each morning brought new search efforts, new volunteers, new expressions of hope. Each evening brought vigils and prayers. And through it all, Joanne and Andrew maintained their facade, accepting help and sympathy, while knowing that the search was futile, that AJ would never be found alive because AJ was already dead. But the performance could not hold forever. Detectives, from the very beginning, had harbored suspicions about the parents. Their stories were inconsistent. Their behavior was off. The condition of their home raised serious questions about what kind of life AJ had been living. And as the investigation progressed, as evidence accumulated, those suspicions hardened into certainty. Detective Brian Zillhaver of the Crystal Lake Police Department led the investigation, working closely with FBI agents and other law enforcement partners. Zillhaver was an experienced investigator who had worked child abuse cases before, who knew how to read parents, who could distinguish genuine grief from performed emotion. From his first interactions with Joanne and Andrew, he sensed that something was deeply wrong. The investigation proceeded on two parallel tracks. Publicly, the search for AJ continued. The hope maintained that he might be found alive. Privately, detectives were building a case against his parents, gathering evidence that would prove what they increasingly believed, that AJ had never been kidnapped, that he had been killed by the people responsible for his care, that his parents were lying about everything. The break came through a combination of forensic evidence and skilled interrogation, the patient accumulation of facts that stripped away the parents' deception layer by layer. The break came through a combination of forensic evidence, digital analysis, and skilled interrogation. The patient accumulation of facts stripped away the parents' deception layer by layer, exposing the truth they had tried so hard to hide. Detectives had obtained search warrants for the Freund home, the parents' vehicles, and their electronic devices within the first days of the investigation. What they found painted a picture very different from the story the parents were telling. In the home, forensic technicians conducted a detailed examination that revealed evidence of violence. Using luminol, a chemical that reacts with blood to produce a visible glow, they found traces in the bathroom and other areas that had been cleaned. The luminol revealed stains that were invisible to the naked eye, residue that remained despite the parents' efforts to scrub away the evidence. The pattern of the blood evidence was inconsistent with an accident, and entirely consistent with the theory that violence had occurred in the home. Blood had been shed in that house, and someone had tried to clean it up. The effort at concealment was itself evidence of consciousness of guilt. The parents' cell phones provided crucial evidence as well. Modern smartphones track their users' locations through a combination of GPS, cell tower connections, and Wi-Fi networks. This data creates a digital trail that shows where a phone has been and when. For investigators, this trail can be more reliable than any witness, a silent recorder that does not lie. Analysis of Andrew Freund Sr.'s phone showed that it had traveled to the Woodstock area in the early morning hours of April 16th, the day after AJ was likely killed. The movements were inconsistent with his stated activities. He had claimed to be home all night, but his phone had traveled to a location several miles away, to the area where AJ's body would eventually be found. Joanne's phone showed no such movement, suggesting that she had remained at the home while Andrew disposed of the body. The division of labor was clear. She had killed their son, and he had buried him. Both were culpable, but their roles had been different. Investigators also examined the family's internet search history, looking for evidence of premeditation or consciousness of guilt. What they found was disturbing. Searches related to death, decomposition, and other topics that an innocent person would have no reason to research. The timing of some searches suggested that the parents had been planning how to respond even before the crime was committed. Video surveillance from the neighborhood provided additional evidence. Cameras at nearby homes and businesses had captured images of the Freund vehicles at relevant times, showing movements that contradicted the parents' statements. The surveillance footage helped establish a timeline that aligned with the theory of the crime. Confronted with this mounting evidence, detectives prepared for the interrogations that would break the case open. They had developed a strategy based on the dynamics of the relationship between Joanne and Andrew, the evidence they had gathered, and their assessment of each suspect's psychology. The interrogations took place over several days, with both parents questioned separately and repeatedly. The goal was to create psychological pressure, to confront them with evidence, to exploit inconsistencies between their stories, and ultimately to get one of them to break. Joanne was defiant at first, insisting on her innocence, claiming that she had no idea what had happened to AJ. She was combative with detectives, refusing to engage with their questions, demanding to know why she was being treated as a suspect rather than a victim. Her performance was convincing to an outside observer, the apparent outrage of a mother wrongly accused. But the detectives had evidence, and they used it methodically. They confronted Joanne with the blood evidence from the home. They showed her the cell phone data. They pointed out the inconsistencies in her story. Each piece of evidence was another crack in her facade, another challenge that she struggled to explain. Andrew Sr. was less defiant. but equally uncooperative at first. He presented himself as a confused, bewildered father who did not understand why he was being questioned. He seemed almost passive, deferring to investigators, giving answers that were vague and unhelpful. He was either genuinely lost or playing a role designed to avoid accountability. The interrogations went on for hours, then days. The detectives rotated, maintaining pressure while avoiding the fatigue that could lead to mistakes. They returned again and again to the evidence, to the inconsistencies, to the questions that the parents could not answer satisfactorily. Finally, on April 24th, 2019, Andrew Freund Sr. broke. After hours of questioning, after being confronted repeatedly with evidence that contradicted his denials, he admitted the truth. AJ was dead. He had been dead for days. And Andrew knew where his body was buried. The confession was captured on video. Andrew's face drawn and exhausted as he finally abandoned the lies he had been telling. He described finding AJ dead, claimed that Joanne had been responsible, and detailed how he had wrapped his son's body in plastic, driven to a remote location, and dug a shallow grave in a field. He led detectives to the location, a site near Woodstock that matched the cell phone data that had first raised suspicions. The discovery of AJ's body confirmed everything the evidence had suggested. He was found in a shallow grave, wrapped in plastic, buried by his father, while his mother maintained the pretense that he was missing. The boy who had been the subject of so much hope and prayer was gone, had been gone from the beginning. The victim not of a stranger, but of the people who were supposed to love him most. The news spread through Crystal Lake and beyond, transforming vigils of hope into gatherings of grief and anger. The community that had come together to search for AJ now came together to mourn him and to demand justice for his killers. The candles that had been lit to guide him home now burned in memory of a child who would never come home. Joanne Cunningham and Andrew Freund Sr. were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. They were also charged with aggravated battery, concealment of a homicide, and other offenses related to AJ's death and the attempt to cover it up. Both faced the possibility of spending the rest of their lives in prison. The details that emerged in the following days and weeks revealed the full horror of what AJ had endured. The autopsy showed that he had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a severe beating. His body showed evidence of other injuries, some old, some new, a map of abuse that extended back months or years. The medical examiner also noted signs of neglect. AJ was underweight for his age, showed evidence of malnutrition, and had other health issues that had gone untreated. The abuse that killed him was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of mistreatment. Perhaps most disturbing was the evidence of what had happened in the hours before AJ's death. Investigators determined that Joanne had forced AJ to take a cold shower as punishment for some minor infraction, possibly soiling his pants. It was April in Illinois, still cold, and the shower would have been frigid. When AJ emerged from the shower, shivering and crying, Joanne beat him. She beat him with her fists. She beat him with a broom. She beat him until his small body could not take any more. And then, rather than getting him help, she let him die. Andrew Sr. watched some of this abuse, did nothing to stop it, and then helped dispose of the body. His passivity made him as guilty as Joanne in the eyes of the law. A parent who stands by while their child is beaten to death is not a bystander, but a participant. The legal proceedings that followed were relatively straightforward, given the overwhelming evidence. Both parents faced charges that could result in decades in prison, and both eventually pleaded guilty rather than face trials where conviction was virtually certain. Joanne Cunningham's case proceeded first. Her attorneys initially considered various defense strategies, including claims of diminished capacity due to substance abuse, but the evidence was too strong to overcome. The forensic evidence, the digital trail, Andrew's confession implicating her as the one who had actually beaten AJ to death, all of it pointed inexorably to her guilt. On December 3, 2019, approximately 8 months after AJ's death, Joanne Cunningham stood in a McHenry County courtroom and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The plea meant that there would be no trial, no need for prosecutors to present their evidence to a jury, no opportunity for the defense to raise doubts or alternative theories. In her plea, Joanne admitted to beating AJ, acknowledged that her actions had caused his death, and accepted responsibility for the crime. The words came out flat and unemotional, delivered by a woman who seemed disconnected from the enormity of what she was admitting. She did not cry. She did not apologize. She simply said what she needed to say to enter her plea. Her sentencing hearing, held on July 16, 2020, provided an opportunity for those affected by AJ's death to speak about its impact. The courtroom was filled with family members, community members, and representatives of the agencies that had failed to protect AJ. Each speaker added another dimension to the portrait of loss that AJ's death had created. AJ's teachers spoke about the boy they had known, a child who came to school eager to learn despite the chaos of his home life. They described his smile, his enthusiasm, his resilience. They remembered a child who deserved so much better than he got. Family members spoke about the hopes they had held for AJ, the future they had imagined for him, the void that his death had created. Some expressed anger at Joanne, at the system that had failed AJ, at the circumstances that had led to this moment. Others simply wept, their grief too profound for words. Representatives of DCFS acknowledged the agency's failures, the missed opportunities to intervene, the decisions that had left AJ in a dangerous home. Their words were not an excuse, but a recognition, an acceptance of responsibility that, while it could not bring AJ back, at least demonstrated that the system understood what it had done wrong. The prosecutor argued for the maximum sentence, describing the brutality of AJ's death, the callousness with which his body had been disposed of, the deception that had followed. This was not a case of a moment's anger that resulted in an unintended death, he argued. This was sustained, deliberate violence against a helpless child, followed by an elaborate cover-up. It deserved the harshest punishment available. Joanne's attorney argued for a lesser sentence, citing her history of addiction, her difficult upbringing, the factors that might explain, if not excuse, her conduct. The argument was made because attorneys are obligated to advocate for their clients, but it landed with a thud in a courtroom filled with people who had seen photographs of AJ's bruised body. Judge Robert Wilbrandt listened to all the statements, considered the arguments, and pronounced his sentence. Joanne Cunningham was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Given her age and the length of the sentence, she will likely die behind bars. It was the maximum sentence available under the law, a recognition of the severity of her crime and the special depravity involved in a parent killing her own child. I would say to you that this is the worst case I've ever had to sentence, Judge Wilbrandt said. You took the life of a young, trusting, and defenseless child. You showed no remorse and didn't even have the humanity to lead police to his body. Joanne showed no reaction as the sentence was read. She was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, beginning the decades of incarceration that lay ahead of her. Andrew Freund Sr.'s case took longer to resolve. His attorneys explored various legal strategies, including arguments that he should be treated less harshly than Joanne, because he had not been the one to actually beat AJ to death. But the law does not provide such easy distinctions. Andrew had failed to protect his son. He had watched or known about the abuse without intervening. He had disposed of the body and helped construct the lie that AJ had been kidnapped. Under Illinois law, his actions made him equally guilty of murder. Andrew pleaded guilty to first-degree murder on November 13, 2020, more than a year after his arrest. Like Joanne, he admitted to his role in AJ's death and accepted responsibility for the crime. Unlike Joanne, he showed emotion during the proceedings, appearing to struggle with what he had done. His sentencing hearing, held on January 12, 2021, featured many of the same speakers who had addressed Joanne's sentencing. Family members again described their loss. Community members again expressed their grief and anger. The prosecutor again argued for a lengthy sentence. Andrew addressed the court before sentencing, something Joanne had not done. His statement was rambling and emotional, mixing expressions of remorse with attempts at explanation. He spoke about his failures as a father, his inability to stand up to Joanne, his regret for the choices he had made. Whether the remorse was genuine or simply a calculated appeal for leniency, only he knows. "I'm sorry for all of this," Andrew said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for what happened to my son. I loved AJ. I know that sounds hollow now, but I did love him. I failed him. I failed him in every way a father can fail a child." The judge was unmoved by the display. He noted that Andrew had had many opportunities to intervene, to protect his son, to report what was happening. He had chosen not to. He had chosen to help dispose of the body. He had chosen to lie to investigators. His tears now could not undo those choices. Judge Wilbrandt sentenced Andrew Freund Sr. to 30 years in prison. The sentence was less than Joanne's, reflecting the court's determination that while both were guilty, she had been the primary actor in the abuse that killed AJ. But the sentence was still severe, and given Andrew's age at the time of sentencing, he will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. "I can't understand how a father could dispose of his son like that," Judge Wilbrandt said. "I've thought about it a lot, and I just can't understand it. You had a choice, and you made the wrong choice. You made a choice that prioritized your own interests over the life of your child." Andrew was led away to begin his sentence, joining Joanne in the prison system that would hold them both for the foreseeable future. Their younger son, AJ's brother, remained in foster care, eventually being adopted by a family that could provide the love and stability he deserved. The convictions brought a measure of closure to the case, but they could not undo the damage that had been done. AJ was dead. The system had failed him. Two people who should have loved and protected him had instead tortured and killed him, and no amount of prison time could bring him back. The investigation into DCFS's handling of the Freund family was extensive and damning. A report by the Illinois Office of the Inspector General, released in the months after AJ's death, found multiple failures at every level of the agency. The report was detailed and unflinching, documenting a chain of missed opportunities that, if any one of them had been handled differently, might have saved AJ's life. Caseworkers had missed warning signs that trained professionals should have recognized. Bruises that were clearly inflicted, not accidental. a home environment that was dangerous for children, parents whose behavior should have raised red flags. Time and again, the signs were there, and time and again, they were overlooked or explained away. Supervisors had approved decisions that should have been questioned. When caseworkers recommended closing cases or returning children to their parents, supervisors were supposed to review those decisions, to provide oversight, to catch errors before they became tragedies. In the Freund case, that oversight had failed. Decisions that should have been questioned were approved without adequate review. The system as a whole had prioritized keeping the family together over protecting a child who was clearly at risk. This philosophy, while understandable in theory, had been applied without sufficient attention to the specific circumstances of the Freund family. The bias toward family preservation had become a bias against child protection with fatal consequences. The December 2018 incident, when AJ had been hospitalized with severe bruising, came under particular scrutiny in the report. The Inspector General described the decision to return AJ to his parents after that incident as a catastrophic failure, perhaps the most significant failure in a case marked by failures. The evidence of abuse at that time had been overwhelming. Medical professionals had documented injuries that could not have been accidental. The pattern of bruising was consistent with a beating, not a fall. Any competent assessment should have concluded that AJ was in danger and needed to be removed from his parents' care. Instead, he was returned to them. The caseworker who made that recommendation and the supervisors who approved it had failed to protect him when protection was clearly warranted. Their decisions were influenced by caseload pressures, inadequate training, and a system that made it easier to keep families together than to break them apart. But whatever the reasons, the outcome was the same. AJ went back to the people who would kill him. The caseworker involved in the December 2018 decision faced disciplinary action in the wake of the Inspector General's report. She was not solely responsible for what happened, but she had made decisions that contributed to AJ's death, and those decisions had consequences. Several other DCFS employees were also disciplined or reassigned, but the failures went beyond any individual decision or caseworker. The report found that DCFS was systematically overwhelmed, caught in a cycle of underfunding and understaffing that made quality casework nearly impossible. Caseworkers were carrying caseloads of 40, 50, or even 60 families when professional standards recommended no more than 15. There simply was not enough time to give each case the attention it deserved. Training was inadequate, leaving caseworkers poorly prepared to recognize the signs of abuse and manipulation. Many caseworkers were young and inexperienced, thrown into difficult cases without the mentorship and guidance they needed. The experienced caseworkers who might have helped train them had either left the agency or were themselves overwhelmed with their own caseloads. Resources were insufficient to provide the services that struggling families needed. Substance abuse treatment, mental health counseling, parenting education, and regular monitoring all required money that the agency did not have. Caseworkers were forced to make do with inadequate tools, to hope that families would improve on their own when they could not provide the support needed to make improvement possible. In response to AJ's death and the Inspector General's report, Illinois undertook significant reforms to its child welfare system. Governor J.B. Pritzker, who had taken office just months before AJ's death, made improving DCFS a priority of his administration. Additional funding was allocated to hire more caseworkers and reduce caseloads. Training programs were enhanced and expanded. New protocols were implemented for cases involving allegations of physical abuse. The goal of these reforms was to ensure that the failures that allowed AJ to die would not be repeated. Whether they would succeed depended on sustained commitment, continued funding, and a willingness to prioritize child safety, even when that priority created difficulties for families and caseworkers. AJ's law was passed by the Illinois legislature in 2019, signed by the governor in a ceremony that brought together child welfare advocates, legislators, and members of the community that had mourned AJ. The law required DCFS to take additional steps when investigating reports of abuse, steps that might have made a difference in AJ's case if they had been required earlier. Under AJ's law, DCFS must conduct unannounced visits to homes where abuse is suspected, rather than scheduling visits that give parents time to prepare. The law requires that children be interviewed outside the presence of their parents, reducing the intimidation that might prevent them from disclosing abuse. And it requires the agency to consider a child's entire history with DCFS, not just the current allegation, when making decisions about safety. These requirements were direct responses to the failures. In AJ's case, investigators had conducted scheduled visits that allowed Joanne to clean up and present a facade of normalcy. AJ had never been interviewed alone, where he might have felt safe enough to disclose what was happening to him, and caseworkers had focused on individual reports without considering the pattern that the family's history revealed. Whether AJ's law will prevent future tragedies depends on whether it is implemented effectively, whether the agency has the resources to follow through on its requirements, and whether the culture of child welfare work shifts to prioritize child safety above all else. Laws can create frameworks, but they cannot guarantee outcomes. The true test will come in the cases that unfold in the years ahead, in the children who are protected because caseworkers followed the law's requirements. AJ's death also sparked a broader conversation throughout Illinois and the nation about child abuse and the responsibility of communities to protect vulnerable children. Advocates called for increased awareness of the signs of abuse, for greater willingness to report concerns, for a culture that prioritizes child safety over family privacy or convenience. The neighbors who had seen the condition of the Freund home, who had noticed things that might have been warning signs, who had perhaps suspected that something was wrong but had not reported it, faced their own reckoning. Some came forward after AJ's death to say they wished they had called DCFS, wished they had trusted their instincts, wished they had done something that might have made a difference. This is not to blame those neighbors who had no way of knowing the full horror of what was happening inside that house. But it is to recognize that child protection is everyone's responsibility, that speaking up when something seems wrong might save a child's life, that the cost of being wrong about a suspicion is far less than the cost of being right but silent. A.J. Freund was laid to rest in a ceremony that drew hundreds of mourners, most of whom had never met him in life. They came because his story had touched them, because they wanted to honor a child who had been failed by everyone who should have protected him, because they believed that his death should mean something. The service was held at a church in Crystal Lake, the same community that had searched for AJ, that had hoped and prayed for his safe return, that had mourned when his body was found. The church was filled to capacity, with overflow crowds gathered outside. Speakers remembered AJ as a sweet, gentle boy who deserved so much better than he got. They spoke of his love of dinosaurs, his eagerness to learn, his resilience in the face of circumstances that would have broken many adults. They promised that he would not be forgotten, that his death would lead to changes that would protect other children. A small white casket held AJ's remains. It was adorned with images of dinosaurs, a tribute to the interests of a 5-year-old boy who should have had decades more to explore them. The casket was heartbreakingly small, a visual reminder of just how young AJ was, how much of life he never got to experience. He was buried in a cemetery in Crystal Lake, his grave marked with a headstone that bears his name and the dates that bounded his brief existence. November 29th, 2013 to April 15th, 2019. 5 years, 4 months, and 17 days. A lifetime measured in moments, cut short by the cruelty of those who should have loved him most. Joanne Cunningham sits in prison now, serving a 50-year sentence that will likely keep her behind bars for the rest of her life. She has appealed her sentence, arguing that it was excessive, but the appeals have been unsuccessful. She will grow old in a cell with nothing but time to contemplate what she did to her son. Andrew Freund Sr. serves his 30-year sentence in a different facility. He has expressed remorse, has said that he wishes he had done things differently, has acknowledged that his failures as a father contributed to AJ's death. Whether his remorse is genuine or merely the regret of someone facing consequences, the outcome is the same. He will likely die in prison. Their younger son, AJ's brother, was removed from their custody immediately after AJ's disappearance was reported. He was placed in foster care and has since been adopted by a family who will provide him with the safe, loving home that he deserves. His identity has been protected, and he will grow up away from the shadow of his brother's death, though the trauma of his early years may never fully heal. The house on Dole Avenue, where AJ lived and suffered, stands empty now, a monument to tragedy. The city has considered demolishing it, erasing the physical reminder of what happened there. But as of this recording, it still stands. Neighbors pass it and remember. Some have left flowers or stuffed animals on the lawn, tributes to a boy who once lived there and died there. The legacy of AJ Freund extends beyond the grief and the reforms and the legal proceedings. It lives in the conversations that parents have with their children about safety, in the calls that concerned citizens make to child protective services, in the extra attention that caseworkers pay to cases that might otherwise fall through the cracks. It lives in the memories of those who searched for him, who hoped for him, who mourned for him. It lives in the community that came together in his name and that continues to advocate for children like him. It lives in the simple recognition that every child deserves to be safe, to be loved, to grow up free from fear and violence. AJ Freund was 5 years old. He had a shy smile and watchful eyes. He liked dinosaurs and superheroes and all the things that 5-year-old boys like. He deserved a childhood filled with joy and discovery, with birthday parties and trips to the park, with bedtime stories and morning hugs. He deserved parents who would protect him, nurture him, help him grow into the person he was meant to become. He got none of that. He got chaos and neglect and abuse. He got a mother who beat him and a father who did nothing to stop it. He got a system that saw him, documented him, and sent him back to the people who would kill him. He got 5 years of a life that should have lasted decades. We remember AJ Freund. We honor his memory by protecting the children who are still with us, by speaking up when we see something wrong, by demanding that the systems meant to protect children actually do their jobs. We cannot bring AJ back, but we can make sure that his death meant something, that it led to changes that saved other lives. That is all we can do now. That is everything we must do. Thanks for being here and listening. Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe and take care with your loved ones.